Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. So we were talking a lot about diet and nutrition with students, and we were talking about things that we look at when we start thinking about the desires that we all have to be healthy, to cure diseases that plague us, to live longer, to be more youthful. Where we start thinking about all of the things that we get bombarded with in terms of advertisements, in terms of pitches, whether they're dietary supplements or medicines or machines or equipments that are meant to meet those desires. And so we start thinking about those things. We start discussing these things as relates to the dietary aspect of those pitches. And we have to ask ourselves this kind of question in terms of, is it actual treatment? Is it something that is worthwhile doing? Or is it quackery? Is it something that is simply there as a marketing pitch, something to make the people selling the stuff money? Is there actual scientific evidence about things like probiotics, things like prebiotics, where we have to start thinking about, well, what does it actually mean to be prebiotic? What does it actually mean to be probiotic? What's the difference and do they actually work? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
So when we start looking at this idea about prebiotics, probiotics, about this idea about dietary supplements and nutrition as it relates to health, we have to approach the issue with an open mind and be willing to look past all of the antidotes, all the things that kind of govern the discussion that we have about any of these things on social media, within our network of peers, within our social groups. We have to look at the medical studies. We have to look at the science and what is actually seen in the results, whether they're the results that we hear about or that are being touted as being true on social media within our social groups. A lot of those times, the results that we get, a lot of the stories that are told, seem too good to be true. And what we have to do is we have to start thinking about, why is it that we get these marketing pitches? Why is it that we get these too good to be true stories? Is it the fact that we're ignorant to the metabolism, to the underlying science of what's going on? Are we hoping to find something that's going to support our desires, that what we're eating is somehow going to provide that kind of fountain of youth that we're looking for, that holistic approach to care that is going to allow us to uh, be more youthful, to eliminate a lot of the health issues that we're trying to eliminate, a lot of the metabolic issues that we're trying to eliminate? In the end of all this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at and be able to discern fact from fiction, to look at what is the actual truth that's out there, to be able to look at what's being presented and determine, is it misinformation, disinformation, or is it a qualified recommendation? To understand that just because it's being presented to me in an internet search, just because I see somebody present it on a TikTok or on Instagram, just because I see it posted to a Pinterest, or just because I happen to see it as an advertisement, doesn't mean that it's something that should be believed. What we're looking at when we're starting to look at this idea about these probiotics and these prebiotics, there's a lot of noise that we hear about in terms of gut health. And there's a lot of advertisements, there's a lot of pitches, there's a lot of social media postings that talk a lot about how a healthy gut is essential for overall health. Within this noise, we often hear a lot about probiotics. We often hear a lot about prebiotics in terms of either the need to eat foods that have probiotic capacities, or eat foods that are prebiotics, or to use some sort of supplement that is going to contain either a prebiotic or a probiotic, or in some cases, both. But what exactly are we looking at? What are we trying to get from these things, and what benefit do they actually offer? When we start looking at this idea, we have to go past what is being pitched to us within these media posts. The idea about prebiotics, the idea about probiotics, is the indication of either cultures of bacteria, the probiotics, that may offer some sort of metabolic benefit to us, some benefit in terms of digestion and absorption of the nutrients that we have within our foods. When we start looking at the prebiotics, what we're talking about metabolites, we're talking about chemicals that somehow can be used by the bacteria within the gut to metabolize correctly, to normalize their metabolism so that we can somehow confer a health benefit to us. So, what exactly are these items? Probiotics are foods or supplements that contain selected cultures of bacteria that we can find as being beneficial. If we look at what organizations such as the WHO has to say about this, the description of probiotics is indicated as being living organisms, what we can think about as the microbiome, which, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit. That's what the WHO is describing as a probiotic. In general, the probiotics are going to somehow attempt to mirror the microbiome, the bacteria, and all of the single-celled organisms that we have that live within our gut. These probiotics are going to somehow mirror the microbiome that exists in the naturally occurring microbiome of the gut. Because we're adding microbiome to the existing naturally occurring microbiome, the idea here is that it's going to allow for improved function of these symbiotic organisms, these single-celled organisms that will metabolize things that we can't metabolize and will confer some sort of benefit to us from that metabolism. What it's going to do is it's going to improve the function of these symbiotic organisms to allow for a health benefit to be realized. If we start thinking about what types of foods, what types of products are going to have these probiotic conditions to them, these are typically going to be the fermented foods that we eat, the cultured foods that we eat. These include dairy products like yogurt, kefir, cheeses, as well as the non-dairy yogurt, kefir, and cheeses. These are also going to be the fermented and pickled vegetables, the sauerkraut, the kimchis, the soy products, the tempeh, the miso, the natto. These are the things that we think about when we start thinking about probiotic foods. We also have to think about things that come about in terms of fermented drinks. This is the kombucha, the vinegars that people will drink. This is where the idea about getting this health benefit from kombucha, from the apple cider vinegars in terms of improvements of metabolic health is coming into play. The supplements that we look at in terms of the probiotic supplements are typically looking at having 2 or 3 strains of bacteria. The 2 or 3 strains of bacteria are coming from basically 3 genuses. That's the kind of the groupings that we look at in terms of biological life for bacteria. And this includes the bifidobacteria such as Bifidoaminellus, Bifidobarbia, Bifidolactis, and Bifidolongum, as well as the lactobacillus, such as Lactobacillus acidophilus and Lactobacillus reuteri. And then we have the Saccharomyces, and in particular Saccharomyces boulardii. And so those are the 3 principal strains that we talk about when we talk about having the bacteria, the microbiome, in supplement. Those are the foods that we usually talk about when we talk about being probiotic in terms of the foods that we're eating. And once again, we're talking about having foods, we're talking about supplements that are going to contain some of the strains of bacteria that we see within the gut that is going to supplement the bacteria that we already have in the gut. We'll get to what it actually means a little bit later on in terms of what benefits we get and whether or not the benefits are actually true or not. In terms of the prebiotics, we're looking at nutrients, and nutrients that are predominantly coming from plant-derived foods, or metabolites that are coming from the nutrients that arise from plant-derived foods. Most of these are going to be in terms of fiber or metabolites of fiber. And so we start looking at any of the products that are purporting having high amounts of prebiotic effect. They are really looking at foods that are high in fiber. The description that we normally give to the foods or to the supplements that are the prebiotics are typically going to be metabolites that are going to be selectively utilized by our microbiome that are coming from fiber. that will, because of the exposure to fiber, will will give some sort of health benefit to us. The prebiotics allow for higher likeliness, higher likelihood for having typical metabolic functions within the microbiome of the gut that will allow for better overall activity of these microbiomes within the gut that will allow us to have the benefits that we tend to say prebiotics give us. And so we start looking at some of the advertisements that we hear as relates to these probiotics, these prebiotics. What they're really talking about is they're talking about either adding things that to our diet that will allow for better metabolism taking place within the microbiome of the gut, or adding a few specific strains of bacteria to the gut. When we start looking at these prebiotics, the most popular foods that we talk about as having high prebiotic potentials are things like legumes, the beans, the peas, cereals and whole grains, oats, bran, barley, rye, fruits such as bananas, berries, grapefruits, olives, which is a fruit, even though we usually think about it in terms of an oil, vegetables like garlic and leeks and onions, nuts and their oils, seeds and their oils, such as flaxseed, pistachios, almonds. But then we also have some other substances that come into play. And once this goes back to some of the things that might be fermented, such as the vinegars that were mentioned in terms of having a probiotic effect as well. There are also several products that are going to be marketed and sold as having prebiotic potentials due to having specific compounds within them. This is predominantly going to have compounds such as inulin, as well as oligosaccharides like fructooligosaccharide, galactooligosaccharide, xylo-oligosaccharide, isomalto-oligosaccharides, polydextrose, butyrates, lactulose, polyphenolic substances, and polyunsaturated fatty acid precursors are PUFAs, PUFAs, are polyunsaturated fats, and their precursors such as linoleic acids, whether it's alpha linoleic acid itself, or conjugated linoleic acid. And so when we start looking at these substances, what we're really talking about is we're talking about substances that are purported to have benefits that will allow for once again the gut microbes to work better, if we want to think about in terms of that idea. The idea for both the supplements, whether it's prebiotic or probiotic, as well as the foods that have high amounts of prebiotic or probiotic potential, is all about altering the health of the microbiome within the gut. The idea has some support given the linkage that we have between hyperactivity of our microbiome, hyperactivity of the bacteria within the gut, as relates to exposure to processed foods, whether it is mildly processed, whether it is ultra processed, whether it is partially refined, whether it's partially processed foods. The more processing the food has, the more we see hyperactivity within the microbiome of the gut. That hyperactivity, that overactivity within the microbiome of the gut, has an altering effect on our metabolism as relates to the chronic inflammation issues that are usually associated with non-communicable diseases, the metabolic diseases that we hear about and that we tend to fear, things like cardiovascular disease, things like metabolic diseases like diabetes, cancers, those types of factors. Now, the other thing that can come into play as it relates to the gut health that we're trying to counterbalance with these probiotics and with these prebiotics is exposure to food additives that have hydrocarbon-based chemicals. The hydrocarbon-based chemicals are like the food dyes as well as the food preservatives that act as metabolic disruptors. And one of the things that it will disrupt is it's going to disrupt the microbiome within the gut. All of these disruptions that we see from these processed foods tend to increase levels of inflammation. The linkages that have led to many to stipulate that we need to seed our intestines with beneficial bacteria that we can get from these supplements, that we can get from these foods, based off of the ability to offset the negative health issues that can come about from eating the processed foods, is important, especially considering how extremely difficult it is to have a diet that is comprised almost completely of non-processed foods. So the inability to eat foods that have zero processing, whether that processing is coming from a food plant that is a manufacturer, or the processing that takes place within our own kitchen. The inability to have foods that are not processed means that we have to have this kind of awareness too. The fact that some of the foods that we're eating may have a negative metabolic impact on the microbiome within the gut. And if we trace a lot of the educational literature, a lot of the medical literature, and a lot of the medical history literature, there is a very tight linkage between the impact that diet has on gut metabolism and overall chronic levels of inflammation. It's a linkage more than a cause and effect. And so this is where we have to start thinking about in terms of true benefits that we might get from this probiotic and these prebiotics. Along with the linkage about the changes in metabolism, the excessive growth of selective bacteria within the microbiome from the processed foods we eat can lead to a less healthy gut in total. That is where we're, instead of having a wide swath of bacteria, a wide swath of microbiome within the gut, within the intestines, we start to lose some of the microbiome because they get outcompeted by these strains of bacteria, by these strains of microbiome that are able to grow on the processed foods that we're consuming. The less healthy gut flora, the less healthy microbiome that we have, gets associated with several changes that we look at as relates to health. One change that we tend to see is changes in feeding regulation. That is, changes of when do I feel hungry, when do I feel full, when am I going to stop eating, when am I going to start eating, what happens to the food when I am in the process of eating as it relates to the signals that I've eaten enough. We get changes in those signals. Changes in those signals are linked with secondary hormonal changes that come about. And those secondary hormonal changes that come about tend to alter metabolism at the fat cells. And it's the alteration that we see at the fat cells that leads to higher fat mass, as well as the changes in feeding regulation, but also changes in inflammation, where we know that there is an actual causal relationship between increases in fat mass and activity of immune cells, leading to higher levels of inflammation, and higher levels of inflammation causing issues in terms of metabolism, leading to the non-communicable diseases that we're trying to prevent through changes in lifestyle. One of those changes in lifestyle are to counter these health issues that we see as relates to the impact that the processed foods have on those changes in metabolic functions, those changes in feeding regulation that lead to overeating, that lead to increases of fat mass, that lead to changes in fat mass, or in terms of fat tissue metabolism. To counter these health issues, a lot of the proponents that we hear touting prebiotic and probiotic supplements, they'll stipulate that eating or supplementing our diet with these substances will help offset the negative effects in three ways. The first way, probiotic supplements or foods offer beneficial bacteria to replace or to supplant the harmful bacteria that has grown or has outcompeted the other beneficial bacteria within the microbiome due to the processed foods in our diet. The second tout that they make, the second argument they make, is that the nutrients contained in the prebiotic supplements or foods will allow for changes in hormonal and metabolite signaling that comes from the microbiome. They're going to limit the hormones and the metabolites that signal the negative effect that we see coming out of the microbiome on our metabolism that causes the chronic inflammation, that causes the fat mass gains, that cause the metabolic diseases to come into play. The third thing that they will tend to tout is that there's a beneficial combination that will occur if we consume both the beneficial bacteria found in the probiotic with a prebiotic source of fiber and nutrients that will allow for these probiotic bacteria to feed on, allowing for improvements in overall health. From these, the proponents are going to stipulate that the benefits that we get from the probiotics and from the prebiotic foods will allow for the following things to come about. They'll allow for better digestive functions and regular bowel movements. They'll allow for improved metabolic fitness, that improved metabolic fitness is going to allow for improved metabolic flexibility, which means I'm able to utilize all of the fuel sources that I have available to me to meet my energy demands to make my ATP for the cells to do what the cells need to do. It's going to allow for improved immune functions. It's going to reduce the chronic level of inflammation by reducing inflammatory signals, by reducing inflammatory metabolites coming away from the gut, coming away from the intestines, or coming away from the immune cells being activated within the intestines. It's going to allow for reduced circulating levels of cholesterol, which is purported to allow for reduced atherosclerosis and improved cardiovascular health. This reduced cholesterol levels can be or should be linked with changes in overall diet, as well as changes in overall physical activity that allows for the primary source of circulating levels of cholesterol, the liver, to be able to better regulate lipid metabolism and lipoprotein metabolism that will allow for improvements in cholesterol levels. It can also be linked with changes in the rate of digestion and absorption of lipoproteins due to having greater amounts of fiber within the intestines that will act as secondary signals to change lipoprotein and lipid digestion and metabolism by the microbiome within the gut that will reduce the total amount of lipids and lipoproteins being absorbed from the foods that we're eating. Because of the improvement in immune functions, because of the reduction in the level of inflammation that we see, there can be a reduction in eczema outbreaks, in skin irritation outbreaks. Because of improvements in immune functions, there could be a reduced risk for fungal infections that can come about. There is indication for improved recovery from gastrointestinal distress for individuals who have irritable bowel issues. There is improved digestive functions following antibiotic treatments that is seen with the use of the prebiotics and the probiotics in individuals who are doing broad spectrum, long duration antibiotic treatments. Additionally, you might hear within advertisements, within pitches, within things seen on social media about how a combination of prebiotic and probiotic supplementations can lead to improvements in mood, can lead to reduction in weight, can lead to better fitness, better improvement in the gym in terms of doing exercise, better performance improvements in cardiovascular fitness, improvements in musculoskeletal fitness, improvement in muscle strength, improvement in muscle endurance. There is a lot of things that get lumped into benefits that come about from the prebiotics and from the probiotics. And this is where we have to go back and think about the idea of the quackery that could be coming into play as relates to some of these pitches. As we get into discussing why might we see benefits and is the benefits actually going to be true? If we're seeing pitches, if we're seeing advertisements that are guaranteeing 100% all the time these changes, or if we're seeing stipulations or arguments of a host of improvements all coming from a single factor, we have to throw up red flags and realize that we're probably getting sold something. If we were to speculate about the benefits of the probiotic foods, the probiotic supplements, the general rationale that is given about adding beneficial bacteria, improving digestion, improving metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins within the intestines. That's the idea here, is that by adding these things, we're going to get a beneficial improvement of the bacteria in terms of digestion and in terms of absorption, in terms of those bacteria themselves metabolizing nutrients that we would not metabolize ourselves. The metabolism of these nutrients by the bacteria in the intestines has a subsequent response to reduce inflammation signals that can trigger responses, that can trigger interactions between our immune cells and the microbiome within our gut. It's an argument that can be made as the proper functioning microbiome ensures that appropriate nutrients and metabolites are being absorbed within the intestines following the digestion of the foods that we eat. digestion and absorption that is impacted by the type of foods that we eat, the processed food, the partially processed food, the ultra processed food, the whole foods, and food additives that may or may not be used to extend the shelf lives that the foods have. Some of these speculations of the benefits as it comes to the prebiotics come from the digestive benefits that can occur from having diets with higher amounts of fiber relative to the other sugars in the meal. An argument that can be offered because the prebiotics is just the big fancy word for foods that and supplements that typically contain a higher concentration of fiber within them. Benefits that are going to rise from fiber serving as the fuel source for the bacteria in the intestines allow for changes in the rate of digestion and absorption of nutrients, leading to changes in when we feel hungry, when we feel full, when are we going to start eating, when we're going to stop eating, how soon are we going to stop eating once we start eating, improvement in the absorption of electrolytes, improvement in the absorption of other metabolites that we find in higher amounts in plants and in higher fiber foods. The idea that gets presented as relates to the prebiotics is that it's going to allow for a better microbiome and a better microbiome health by offering the best nutrition, put quotes around that, to reinforce the growth of the good bacteria, put quotes around that, and minimize the growth of the bad bacteria, put quotes around that. And so the idea here is that we're going to somehow change the microbiome to our benefit by simply adding more bacteria into it, or by changing the nutrients that are available to the microbiome itself, which has some credence if we look at the metabolism of foods within the gut that we don't actually metabolize ourselves. Our cells within the gut don't metabolize, but the microbiome does. That will produce some chemicals that allow for better overall health to come about because those metabolites that are being formed offer some benefit to us. If we look at this idea about having a healthy gut microbiome from the foods and from the supplements that we eat, there is evidence to support the idea that these things work. Consuming the right foods or supplements that contain certain strains of probiotics or have the prebiotics in them can be beneficial. It's true, especially if you look at people who have metabolic issues or people who are eating diets high in processed foods. But there's a huge caveat here. There's a caveat that we have to look at as relates to how true that yes statement happens to be. There are a number of anecdotes out there about people who will stipulate that it was the prebiotic and the probiotic that allowed them to have an improvement in health. But the problem is that most of those are coming from self-reported evidence. And self-reported evidence, anecdotes, is not empirical evidence that we can use to actually make statements as to whether or not the prebiotics or the probiotics are actually beneficial to the person. The research that we have is not very highly inclusive. There is not enough research today on the mechanisms by which the probiotics or the mechanisms by which the prebiotics are able to improve health, whether it's short-term health or long-term health, or whether those health changes in health come by the use of the prebiotics and the probiotics by themselves alone. It's also unclear as to whether or not the prebiotics and the probiotics will actually lower the risk for certain illnesses or certain conditions that we're told to take the prebiotics or told to take the probiotics in order to prevent. We have to remember that, as with all supplements, there is no regulation on the production, distribution, or marketing of the probiotic supplements or the prebiotic supplements. Supplements are not regulated. They're not regulated. And since they're not regulated, there's no guarantee in knowing if we're taking the correct dose for ourselves or if there is a correct dosing. There's limited evidence to indicate that a specific dose is going to have benefit to us or what a therapeutic dose might look like. Additionally, there's no indication that the supplements being purchased as it relates to the probiotics actually have the cultures indicated as being the cultures on the bottle, or if those cultures, those bacteria, are living and viable. There's also issues that have to come about because the strains that are being used in the probiotics may not be as beneficial based off of the limited number of strains that we see within the supplements relative to the total number of strains that we have living symbiotically with us. We are only cultivating a very few number of strains of bacteria, and those are simply the easiest ones to grow in the laboratory to offer as supplements. We have thousands of strains of bacteria microbiome within our intestines, within our gut. Most of the supplements or foods that we have being deemed probiotic maybe have 3 to 5 strains, regardless of the numbers that they give you, whether it's 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000. That 10,000, 20,000, and 30,000 is an indication of cells. It's not an indication of strains. There is concern regarding the types of strains. There is concern about the product formulation that takes place. There is concern about the quality of the product, as well as the storage of the supplements that we take as probiotics, and whether or not any one of those things can impact any of the beneficial effects. Not all supplements have the same type of bacteria or the same concentrations of the bacteria that will limit their overall effectiveness. The probiotic supplements may add bacteria to the microbiome that can actually cause an overload of bacteria. An overload of bacteria of just a few select strains of bacteria that, once again, we find the easiest to cultivate and package within the supplement, that may not actually provide benefit to us by having additional amounts of that specific type of bacteria within our gut. Many of the products being sold as probiotic or prebiotic make claims without proof of efficacy. Once again, we don't know what the dose happens to be. We don't know what dose durations happen to be. We don't know what the upper limit dose happens to be or what the therapeutic dose happens to be. More importantly, if these supplements are not prepared and packaged correctly, they will not survive the exposure to the acids within the stomach. Most of these substances do not tolerate exposure to the low pH, the acid condition that we find in our stomach. The last thing that's going to impact the ability for the probiotic or the prebiotic to work is related to the biology and the evolution that takes place over our lifespan. Each of us has a gut microbiome that is unique to us. We have a unique collection of bacteria that will evolve with us over our lifespan based off of all of the same factors that will impact our overall metabolic health. This is where we have to start thinking about the idea of causation versus the idea of correlation. What we eat will impact our metabolism, but it will also impact the gut microbiome's metabolism. What we do in terms of pro-health lifestyle will impact our metabolism, but will also impact the gut microbiome's metabolism. Everything we do, because we're living in a symbiotic relationship with all of this microbiome, will have an impact on the microbiome as well as on ourselves. Once again, it's a symbiotic relationship. What happens to us is going to impact the microbiome. What happens to the microbiome will impact us. And so it's very hard to indicate that just because we're changing one aspect of lifestyle, it's that one aspect that's going to cause or confer all the health benefits that get reported as being due to the probiotic or due to the prebiotic. If we're eating a variety of foods that contain all the nutrients necessary for proper metabolic functions, there is no need for eating probiotic stuff or eating prebiotic stuff because we're already getting that stuff. Adding probiotic and adding prebiotic supplements may actually impair the function of the gut microbiome and can cause symptoms of digestive distress, can actually overload immune functions, can actually trigger inflammation coming from the gut, even if we're attempting to minimize inflammation coming from the gut. It's not necessarily a need to have as it relates to overall nutrition. We have to remember that we have a diversity of gut bacteria. We have a diversity within our microbiome that needs to be supported to allow for optimal gut health that will play a role in our overall health. Support comes from the inclusion of a variety of foods that allow for the microbiome to metabolize and ferment nutrients correctly, limiting intestinal inflammation signals and providing typical metabolic functions for both the microbiome as well as for ourselves. There is some evidence that having typical activity within the gut microbiome allows for optimal hormone responses during and following meals that will ensure proper feeding regulation and proper metabolic health. But there is no indication that the gut microbiome by itself and alterations to the gut microbiome itself will have a positive benefit for us. Regulation that limits the development of metabolic diseases is the key here. This is where we have to go back and remember that metabolic diseases and metabolic health is a highly complex thing where you have a whole bunch of factors that are all coming into play that will have an impact not only on our metabolism, but on the metabolism of our microbiome. There is limited evidence to say that adding any variety of prebiotic or probiotic foods to our diet can by itself be of benefit. In addition to other pro-health activities, there may be some benefit, particularly for people who have issues with metabolic health already, or issues with gastrointestinal distress already, or people who are on long-term antibiotics already. But outside of those populations, there's not true benefit that can arise from using prebiotic or probiotic foods as it relates to altering gut health or metabolic health for those of us who are already healthy. And this is where we have to go back and start thinking about the idea about, is it a actual therapeutic thing or is it some sort of quackery? This is where we have to think about the claims that are being offered about the treatment and whether they seem too good to be true. Do they go beyond the possible scientific explanation? Are they based on some sort of premise that what has been previously sold to us comes from some sort of corporate overlords that are somehow trying to hinder our overall health? Or if we're trying to seek advice and get treatments that are going to somehow be indoctrinated into a long-term care policy where we have to continue to do what is being sold to us. A lot of what we see in terms of the antidotes, a lot of what we see in terms of the marketing schemes as it relates to the prebiotics and the probiotics is reliant upon pseudoscientific principles to support claims. Most of the supplements that we see are highly proprietary. There is very little clarity in terms of what is actually there. And that's due to the fact that most of what's being sold is unregulated. We have unsubstantiated methods and claims about the possibilities for why the prebiotics and why the probiotics will work, independent of all of the other things that we do within our pro-health lifestyle. There is an over-reliance upon the antidotes. There's an over-reliance upon the sensationalism as relates to the advertisements that we see for the probiotics and for the prebiotics. What you have to remember is that if we are already healthy, if we're eating a wide variety of foods, if we're offering the gut microbiome what the gut microbiome needs, if we are already pro-health, there is very limited evidence to stipulate that we need to have the addition to our diet of prebiotics or probiotics. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you got a bit out of the conversation as it relates to what a prebiotic is, what a probiotic is, and whether or not they can offer us any type of health benefit. If you have comments or questions about the topics that we're presenting here, such as the topic of prebiotics and probiotics, please feel free to leave them in comments. We're more than happy to address those in subsequent talks. Please make sure you give us a big 5-star rating. Give us a big thumbs up if you like what we're putting out there. Please make sure you're sharing out with all your friends and family. Follow us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube. The written stuff in Substack, such as the passage that we just published as it relates to the same topic here on prebiotics and probiotics. Make sure you're getting the quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. Stay tuned for future talks as we, once again, will start delving into some of the misinformation, disinformation that's out there as it relates to how we can go about living a healthier life, as well as how we can use science to make sure that we are living a healthy life.